We're late to the game. Not because the game began yesterday, but because we watched the pieces move across the board for generations, quietly at first, then all at once, and still pretended it would end on its own. There's a difference between disrupting the old order and building something new. One breaks, the other restores. And too many people, too many institutions, chose disruption as their default, because disruption is profitable in the short term, and profit is not the same thing as progress. There's a class of people who seem to know war the way other people know bread, something they're trained to make, manage, expand, and justify. They measure time in conflicts. They measure security in arsenals. They measure influence in fear. Their economies don't simply survive war, they are shaped by it. Entire careers are built around escalation. Entire industries learn to feed the cycle. And when the cycle becomes the business model, violence stops being an emergency and becomes a lifestyle. But the world is tired. Not tired in the way people get tired during a weekend, tired in the way a house gets tired of rot. Tired in the way a planet gets tired of being treated like a dump. Tired in the way human bodies get tired of counting losses. We've grown used to the sounds, the headlines, the sirens, the promises, the investigations that never finish, the never again that keeps repeating like a ritual with no results. The pattern is so consistent it feels scripted. And the tragedy is that this pattern doesn't stay behind the walls of power. It spills outward into everyday life. It shows up in families who can't plan for the future because the future keeps changing into something darker. It shows up in towns that lose their youth, not because youth is scarce, but because it's targeted. It shows up in refugees who don't move because they want to. People don't pack their lives because they're bored, they pack because their home became unsafe. It shows up in chronic fear, in intergenerational trauma, in the slow erosion of trust between neighbors and nations. So when people ask, why can't it stop? There's an uncomfortable answer. Because violence has become a way of organizing the world. When violence is treated like a tool, the temptation is to use it again and again. When harm is normalized, it becomes easier to rationalize the next harm. And when violence is lucrative, when it funds power, protects privilege, and silences accountability, then stopping is not in the interest of the people who benefit. But there is a limit to every system built on extraction. Chaos consumes itself. Even if violence can postpone consequences for a while, it can't erase them forever. The bill eventually arrives. Sometimes it arrives as a financial collapse. Sometimes as political instability. Sometimes as ecological disaster. Sometimes as a moral collapse that feels like nothing is sacred anymore. And sometimes, when the weapons are large enough, it arrives instantly, with consequences so enormous that, later, becomes meaningless. That's the reason the coming Earth will be different from the chaos machine we have today. Not because the universe is sentimental. Not because justice is guaranteed by anyone's speeches. But because systems built on destruction eventually break under the weight of their own contradictions. A world dominated by war doesn't just destroy bodies. It destroys futures. It diverts resources away from health, education, housing, clean water, and basic stability. It turns science into a servant of aggression instead of a guardian of life. It teaches people, especially young people, that survival is a competition, that empathy is weakness, and that power is the only language that counts. Over time, a society can lose its ability to imagine anything better, because its imagination has been trained to expect conflict. And that's when decline stops being a threat and becomes a reality. People begin to live smaller lives. Communities become suspicious. Truth becomes flexible. Compassion becomes costly. The more the system relies on violence to keep itself standing, the more it must also rely on lies to keep people obedient. That's how the machine stays running, because if people fully understood what was happening, they would stop the machine. So the machine has to blur the truth, confuse the narrative, and exhaust the public into acceptance. Yet even when the chaos machine is strong, it's still fragile. It is fragile because it depends on continuous fuel. It depends on constant grievances. It depends on constant enemies. It depends on constant fear. And fear is exhausting to live inside. You can keep a person afraid for a short time. You can't keep a whole society afraid forever without damaging it beyond recovery. That's why the turning point matters. Not everyone will wake up at the same time. Not everyone will believe the same signs. But more and more people are noticing that normal has been the disguise for disaster. They're noticing that the costs of conflict are paid by the powerless. They're noticing that propaganda is easier than responsibility. They're noticing that the environment doesn't care about political slogans, it responds to harm with consequences that don't negotiate. This is where the message becomes hopeful, not because it promises painless outcomes, but because it promises a different direction. When the chaos machine finally loses control, when its momentum breaks, the vacuum that follows can become a chance to rebuild. And rebuilding is not the same as revenge. Rebuilding is the slow work of restoring trust, re-establishing care, repairing damaged systems, and creating new norms that make peace the default rather than the exception. The earth cannot heal while people keep treating it like a battlefield. The planet is not a pawn. The biosphere is not impressed by slogans. Rivers don't stop running polluted because leaders requested a better press cycle. Soil doesn't regain fertility because a minister gave a speech. Healing takes time and humility and consistent action, things that war systems rarely allow. So what does a different earth look like? It looks like people choosing creation over destruction. It looks like economic systems measured by human well-being rather than weapon output. It looks like technology used to protect life, energy that cleans the air, medicine that prevents suffering, communications that help communities organize for mutual aid rather than mutual hate. It looks like laws that hold power accountable instead of laws that protect power from consequences. It looks like education that teaches critical thinking instead of obedience. It looks like cultures that can grieve without turning grief into fuel for more violence. And yes, it also looks like consequences. Systems that feed on aggression don't get to feed forever without consequence. Something has to give, either through reform, or through collapse, or through the breaking of the illusion that violence can continue without end. The difference now is that more people are no longer willing to pretend. More people are seeing the pattern. More people are refusing to inherit the script. If you want the simplest version, humans are not going to be here as we are, because, as we are, has become a prison. Not a prison of chains, but a prison of habits. A prison of incentives. A prison of fear. A prison of lies. And prisons eventually fail, either from resistance or from structural collapse. The chaos machine will not be immortal. It cannot be, because it's built against the very conditions needed for a stable civilization. So the question becomes, what happens after? Will we rebuild the same machine with a new logo? Will we replace one set of rulers with another set of controllers? Will we find new justifications for old harm? Or will we finally learn the lesson written into every crisis, that you can't keep using violence to solve problems violence created? A better earth won't arrive because someone wins a battle and calls it peace. It will arrive because enough people decide that peace is not weakness, it's the only sustainable strength. It will arrive when we stop treating human life as a negotiable resource. It will arrive when communities act like the future belongs to children, not to conflicts. We're late, but not beyond repair. The game was designed to keep us chasing distractions while the machine consumed the world. But we can step out of that loop. We can choose creation. We can demand accountability. We can protect the vulnerable. We can rebuild trust where it has been broken. And if the chaos machine is destined to end, by whatever forces bring down systems that can't continue, then the responsibility for what comes next lands squarely on us. Not on war. Not on fear. Not on leaders selling inevitability. On us, the people who decide that this time, the future will not be made out of ash.